Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. I am Indulekha. I am presenting this work, which was done with my former student Hari. Actually, I was initially wondering how this talk would fit in with this particular meeting, but today, the first talk of today morning gave me some confidence that maybe there was some meaning even for this talk in this meeting. So this whole journey started with, let's say, the UNESCO looking at intangible heritage. So in that context, I had looked at some of the traditional aspects of agriculture, which is present in the language of the region where I'm coming from in India, the southernmost portion, southwest coast. And I had tried to understand these in the context of man-human environment relations and sustainability using the principles of physics. Because when we think of natural phenomena, everything finally boils down to physics. So that is how the journey started, trying to get an understanding using physics. The same will work here also. So from trying to understand these cultural practices with and customary practices with respect to agriculture, trying to understand them in terms of physics, I reached a data set which was on rubber plantations, soil monitoring sites within rubber plantations along the southwest coast of India. And the FAO clubs plantations with forests in the matter of resources. And I was wondering how much this held true with respect to water resources. And also we find, especially in the context of global warming and climate change, that cropped land is, carbon is good for carbon sequestration because soil can hold a lot of carbon and it is an important reservoir into which you can store carbon. And again, in the context of rising population pressure, because rubber is mostly grown in regions, Southeast Asia, for example, where the population pressure is quite high. And following on the centuries after Industrial Revolution and the Second World War baby boom, the population has increased in situ in this region and the population pressure is quite high. And the world is due to see some rise in population also. So in this context, land use, land cover changes has been quite, let us say, large scale and to a high level within India, and in particular within this southwest coast region of India, the Indian state of Kerala, which has been historically a place of very high population density, not just density, extensive population density. The area over which this high population density is existing is large. So we are looking at LULC changes and some soil hydrological properties, looking at it statistically and then trying to understand it using physics. So we have a cropland and a carbon sequestration. We have this work which looks at the global pattern and change of cropland soil organic carbon. Within the 100 odd years, they find that there has been an increase in carbon sequestrated in soil of almost 125% increase in the carbon sequestrated in soil. And again, Vitusek et al., this is 1997, had pointed out that anthropogenic land use changes can be raising a serious risk that goes beyond even global climate change. So it is important to look at the impacts of anthropogenic land use changes. And a study which has looked at the impact of rain-fed agriculture on flooding, it's just come out. It shows that it raises groundwater and increases flooding in South American plains. So land which is traditionally wild or forested being put to crop can cause this kind of change. And we want soil to hold water for us. We want soil to hold carbon for us. So that is the two of the principal ecosystem services that soil can provide. Deep soil. Topsoil, of course, we know we need it for growing food, plants, flora and fauna. And again, if you look at rubber plantations, we find that within a decade, practically 2 million hectares of forested land have been put to converted to rubber plantations. So that shows, because of the worldwide demand for rubber, you need it for automobile tires, etc., which demand, I mean, I have not heard of alternatives other than some very special shape memory alloys or whatever. So the demand is there. So the cultivation is getting more and more extensive. So, but what is the impact? So the impact, see this global review of rubber plantations, and often when you read various papers which look at the impact of rubber plantations, commonly quoted effects on water include, downstream water scarcity, dry season water shortage, water table drawdown, etc. But in some very few cases, they'll say maybe it is due to increased transpiration, evapotranspiration. Some very few studies report that they find an increase in water availability. A few studies. So this is the area of study. In India, you come to the southwest coast of India, you see that narrow strip. It is bounded on the left by the Arabian Sea, or the right by the Western Ghats. So it's a very thin strip of land, and India is basically gets monsoon rain. So you can see the strip of land along which the soil monitoring sites are distributed. It is the very narrow strip, 700 kilometers long and less than 150 kilometers wide. So meteorological factors do not vary too much across this study area, and geologically it's mainly oldish type of soil, granite, gneiss, charnockite, etc. formations. The number of plantations is 100, and contiguous forest by sacred groves 21. So data from up to 1.5 meter depth is obtained. The core samples with cut sample sizes, lengths extending up to from 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, up to 20 centimeters. The various physical and chemical characteristics have been obtained in this data set. These are some meteorological features, etc., of the region in which these soil monitoring sites exist, are there. So what have we done? We have looked at soil moisture versus clay bar sand as well as carbon. Fedor transfer functions which have been set up usually look at soil moisture as a function of clay bar sand and soil organic carbon, and we find that in this forest soil, we recover the sand water correlation, which is negative, clay water positive, again recovered. In rubber growing soil also, we recover the sand water correlation as well as the clay water standard correlations. But when it comes to soil field moisture and carbon, the box and whisker plots, the top plot shows the water content from left to right. It is forest. The second is rubber plantations, which have a history that they came from forest land, plantations which are set up on forest land. The third is with respect to water content in soil samples of rubber plantations which have a cropped history. I mean, they were set up on land which is already under crop. So forest F, and forest history rubber FHR, and crop history rubber CHR. The bottom plot shows the carbon content of these soil samples. You see that the carbon content is increasing from forest to forest history rubber to crop history rubber, and the water content is decreasing from forest to forest history rubber to crop history rubber. Same. Okay. So soil field moisture and soil organic matter. We find that the top layer shows inverse correlation between soil field moisture and soil organic matter, while across the depth, you find that the relation between carbon and water, there is a negative correlation, which is opposite to what is normally seen. So if we look at rubber soil with forest history, the moisture content is down by 15%, and rubber soil with crop history, the moisture is down by 23%. And we can, this is chrono-sequenced look at the decrease in water content and increase in carbon content. From this, we extrapolated to the water content of cropped soil. And yeah, this is we find that in cropped land, the effect size of soil moisture difference is of 1.769 HST, and the cropland moisture content is down by 30%. So even though carbon sequestration is high, this shows the negative correlation between carbon and water. This again shows the same thing. The relation with cation exchange capacity, positive relation is recovered, but with carbon, water is showing negative correlation. These sites are showing a candy horizon for rubber plantations. Mostly 50% of rubber plantations are showing a development of a candy horizon, where the water movement is slower. Stream flow stationarity is under anthropogenic interventions been examined, and find that most catchment areas which have anthropogenic interventions, stream flow is not stationary. So we've looked at a particular watershed which does not have any dams, etc., across it, but only land use, land cover changes in the watershed area, and we find that the pattern of base flow has changed from an exponential decrease to a sudden drop down. So how do we understand this? We can understand it if we look at development of hydrophobicity for the soil, which is a possibility because in rubber plantations, the biota can change under the ground, which can lead to rhizo deposition, and roots have a lot of lignin, and lignin is hydrophobic. So the possibility, this is how soil water desorption curves for hydrophobic versus hydrophilic soil. So our conclusion is that what we find from the data is that in rubber plantations, moisture is less than in forest, but carbon content is greater. So the question of cropped lands being good for carbon sequestration, it could be inimical for the hydrological properties of soil, is our conclusion. Thank you very much.
That was actually very much on time. Does anyone have any questions for Haluka about the rubber plants? No? Okay. We'll keep our timeline flowing. So thank you very much. That was great. Nice way to kick off the session. And I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to override yours and share screen here. And our next speaker is a local. So we're alternating back and forth on this one. And I'll let him introduce himself since he's here.
Exactly. It's been 4 years. Thank you. There should be an award for people who have the shortest presentation. I will not be the winner, I guarantee, but I have tried to boil it down so I fit within that box. So let's see. My name is Harry Kessels, and I'm a PhD candidate, believe it or not. I'm local here at Trent. I haven't been here 4 years, but the world is online now, so we're okay. Now, after reading this sentence, you will take a deep breath, I hope, and that's for a reason. So let's read the sentence first. Assessing forest understory vegetation responses to nitrogen deposition in Canadian forest ecosystems. So if you now feel the need to inhale, you will inhale 78% nitrogen, and there's 21% oxygen. That's 99%. So that's not the dangerous type. So we're all alive. The reduced and oxidized forms are, of course, the ones that are harmful. And so what happened since nitrogen was discovered in 1977? I wasn't around, and then the periodic table, like that was a Scottish guy, Daniel Rutherford. He discovered that nitrogen. It's not that long ago. 1869, it became part of the periodic table. Dmitry Mendeleev was the one who did it, a Russian scientist, a chemist. And I was only minus 97 years old, and Canada was 2 years old. And what happened since? Like now we have countries battling on a political arena over nitrogen. There's actually a minister of nature conservation and nitrogen in the Netherlands, a minister. Between then and now, a lot has happened, clearly. So, and there's tensions in society. Farmers, consumers, people who drive cars, industry, they've been assigned quota in Northern Western Europe. And there has been quota assigned to countries. So nitrogen, clearly, there is a little problem here. So what is the problem? Well, the problem, if you think how critical it is, it's in our DNA, it's everywhere, we depend on it. You think there's no problem, but there is. So we have had population growth, for 160 years, energy usage, industrial activity. So emissions went up for over a century, and now we have this deposition. Now, governments have attempted to regulate this, and so we have less. We get less. We see the curves going down, but it's not always successful. So what we need, what has been identified in the 1990s, that is the need to include biodiversity in effects in the development of effects-based emission targets. So some of these policies have worked, but some have not. So where can the scientific community come in to help? We need tangible, measurable, and actionable items for the mutual engagement between policy developers and the scientific community. That was slide 1. Actually, slide 2. So let's go through some definitions. Critical load. Critical load is the quantitative estimate. So we need to be able to measure this, below which significant harmful effects on specified sensitive elements of the environment do not occur. So if you're above the critical load, you'll get harm. So looking at the graph, there's always optimum. Too much of anything could kill you. So we have optima, and up to a critical load, it has not been evident there's harm. So that's what the definition of critical load is. There's multiple definitions floating around, but this is the one I've used. Empirical critical load of nitrogen is then the one just focusing on nitrogen. A change point would be where a location, in this case of nitrogen, along the deposition gradient, where the greatest change occurs. And that's of interest for us. These changes can be measured at species level, or also at community level or ecosystem level. And an indicator species would be the one that you would measure on. For example, in forest understory, you would knowledge is there to say that lichens are sensitive and they disappear earlier than, for example, other species, mosses and plants. Some of them emerge. So that is an indication of which direction it is going as an ecosystem. So the objective of this research I've been doing now for 6 months is to assess the impact of nitrogen deposition on forest understory taxa distribution changes and identify change thresholds across nitrogen deposition gradients in Canadian forest ecosystems. You may want to gulp some nitrogen now. So ecozones, they are important because we can then shrink the boxes we're studying and so as to reduce the variation that's not related to what we're trying to study. So this can be divided further. Canada has 15 terrestrial ecozones and 12 marine ecoregions. And the study we are looking at is a part of a larger study that we will continue after this. All these little dots are the measurement points from 3 databases. Today we'll just present results for Saskatchewan, the 4 ecozones within Canada and within Saskatchewan, prairies, boreal plains, boreal shield, and taiga shield. And these are the numbers of ecosites. So the method we used was threshold indicator taxa analysis called Titan. This was applied to this data set from Saskatchewan. And as I mentioned, we will expand this further. This was like not really a trial run, it was an actual run, and we have actual results. So what this method does is a statistical method that we apply to our data to measure, to derive change points. So the points along each gradient of nitrogen deposition at which the most significant individual changes occur. Now, combined, the species will then give you a community change point. That's what we will see visually in a minute. Titan uses bootstrapped resampling to estimate the confidence of the change point through metrics of purity and reliability, as defined below, and probably very familiar for you as statisticians. Ecosite classification. So what I was mentioning about reducing variability within each set, we then subdivided based on habitat. So habitat could be anything, but we chose dominant tree species. Comes along with other variables that you then use to capture and put it in a box. Now, these green cells are the only ones that have the minimum required number of sites, which is 30 for Titan, to actually be able to run it. And so we have 8 of the 24 classifications for this set. Now, when we expand this to across the country, we'll have probably all these boxes green, but for now we just have 8. And those are the ones we are presenting on. So the dominant tree species for these green little boxes cells are poplar, white pine, white spruce, and black spruce. These are the results. So per eco-zone, we've presented the ones that Titan gave us results on. And you can see in the one with the red rectangle on its side that the change points for the boreal plains are, everything is low. It's a remote area, very little industrial activity. Only the oil sands are close by, but if you compare, the boreal shield is more remote, lower deposition levels, and change points at lower levels of nitrogen deposition. So these are kilograms per nitrogen per hectare per year. So that's one observation, is that on average in the boreal shield, the change points are way, like almost half of the change points in the boreal plains. And taiga shield, unfortunately, we only had 33 plots. So we have limited results in terms of reliability, but we do have, it did run, but it didn't give us much. We will see in the next slides which ones it did give us. Yeah, so this suggests that communities where nitrogen deposition has been historically higher may already have lost many sensitive species. So this is an example for a black spruce dominated stand in the boreals, for all the stands in the boreal shield. Now, how to read this? The dot sizes represent reliability of the estimate. Larger dot size means greater reliability, and the horizontal lines represent uncertainty. Longer lines means greater uncertainty. Now, the change points, as in the other table, previous slide, you can see the red line vertically is the ones for, so on the left side, you can see the lichens are disappearing in this ecozone, in this habitat. All of them are lichens. And then there's only one lichen emerging, and some mosses are emerging, and some plants are emerging. That's not surprising that plants start to emerge. Any farmer will know you throw nitrogen, your plants will thrive. So it's not a surprise, but this is in line with what we expected. Now, what do we do next? We should maybe zoom in within these lichens to see what type of lichens do increase and which ones decrease. So as an indicator species, so as we know, plants generally increase, as you can see in the green cells. Mosses show a mixed result. So what next steps would be to study what type of moss are we talking about? Why is it increasing? And that we haven't done that part yet, but we will. For lichens, we've done a little bit further analysis to understand why, for example, in the boreal plains, these lichens also increase and which ones do. So we then distinguished between fruticose, foliose, and crustose lichens, the ones that are most sensitive, also the way they grow. So the fruticose are the ones with most surface, and they will be more sensitive. They will disappear first. So clearly the data show this. They show that the fruticose in the boreal shield, the fruticose lichens disappear most aggressively, along with the foliose ones. So if we compare our results with some other studies, comparable studies, now it's still comparing apples and pears, but you could still look at what others have done and what it looks like. So really depends, again, is the political answer. It depends where, the pine tree, it depends what species we are within the genus. Now, the closest would be the jack pine dominated forests. It's basically the same data set that was used by Nicole van Dinter, and she wrote her master's thesis on it for Professor Hearn, and she did random forests. She used all these variables, analyzed all these variables, and looked at which ones are more dominant in explaining the variability. So the change points she found were comparable to what we found. We found lower levels generally. So summary is that the change points along the deposition gradient point ranged from 1.04 to 2.88. And then for the ones that are increasing in abundance and decreasing in abundance, and for the ones increasing in abundance, it's of course higher. Now, what do we do with this for critical loads? Like, that's the next step, to derive and actually expand the data set. I believe it's premature to now say, oh, this is our conclusion, let's use this for whoever makes decisions for emissions. It's too quick. So we need to do a little bit more thorough analysis on the expanded data set so as to have more reliability in the data. The data that we present are only the reliable data so far, but we want to have more of them. So as to actually increase the volume and actually be able to use it for multiple eco zones, not just the 4 we did. So next steps are to expand it with additional data sets available for Canada, National Forest inventory, and the Saskatchewan data that we used. We will expand. We use the whole data from Saskatchewan and beyond, and the wood buffalo environmental assessment, I believe it's the word, is also a large data set, very useful for us. We will use that. And then the last step, of course, to push out the publication on this and also relate it to the knowledge that is available on critical loads. That's the end of my pitch. So I don't know how I did with time, but there's a question mark there. So.
Thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable presentation. I admire your presentation skills. I just would like a little bit more background on this because I'm not familiar with the application area. What's the mechanism of N deposition, and how do you attribute changes in those community metrics to nitrogen?
Yeah, so what we do, we assume there's a cause effect, of course, but then we try to reduce the variability outside. So by using the combination of ecozone, it's already capturing biogeoclimatic variables. You shrink those, so you know the variation that it's capturing, that it holds, is already less. So I'm not sure if that answers that part of the question.
I'm thinking more like nitrogen cycle. What form of nitrogen is it? And then is it coming down from atmospheric nitrogen or leaf litter, or how do you think?
It's total nitrogen deposition, wet and dry. It's from the, it's actually it's modeled nitrogen from 2010 in the middle of the period that these samples are from. And these are modeled, so Adagio is the model that was used.
But
for
what are the sources of nitrogen?
Total nitrogen, wet and dry, all of them. No?
So like, can you go back to the cycle?
The ammonium nitrate.
And what do you measure?
Is it nitrogen gas that has put lightning liquid?
So,
What do you measure?
oh, we're using the, for each ecosite, there is a modeled deposition, total deposition from Adagio, the software. So that's a hybrid model to actually estimate what was the total wet and dry nitrogen deposition in that year.
Based on soil climate.
Based on measurements in the field, based on the actual measurements. They model per location. So you extrapolate what this location. They didn't measure it there. They have all these measurements nationwide across the country. And that is the input for this model. So we don't have the measurements on site for that particular, they didn't measure that. Does it make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah, I was wondering, where is the nitrogen coming from?
I'm assuming it's an encapsulation.
Yeah, it's,
We're talking about total nitrogen.
Was it coming from process? You know,
Yeah.
that this is happening by, you could trace the flow of nitrogen or as it cycles, you know, into that understory. Where are the sources? Like, where's
Yeah.
it's coming from a model? I guess I'd have to look at that model.
the model uses the actual measurements across the, so these are pretty accurate maps of Canada through time. these are reliable, that's reliable information to use, if you don't have the measurement on site.
I guess the question is, like, if you look at agricultural site, right?
Yeah.
Where most of the end is and input.
Yeah, yeah.
So in a forestry system, where is most of the information coming?
It's the wet and dry together, like in the air, the concentration in the air. Yeah, and so it's remote areas, right? So whatever comes with the rain or the snow, and then the air concentration of nitrogen.
Atmosphere.
Yeah, in the atmospheric nitrogen.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Okay. Well,
So it's all, these are all remote areas. They're not close to a city or a farm.
Let's jump to our next speaker, and I think we will have hopefully a small window at the very end where we can, we're all kind of talking about forests. Hopefully we'll come back.
Thank you.
On this again. So thank you, Henry. So our next speaker is online.
Was unable to join us in person. And so, Malcolm, I think I saw you there a minute ago.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're there. Perfect. So Malcolm's at UMass Amherst and is going to be continuing our theme of forestry dynamics. Just test the audio again, Malcolm, just make sure.
Sure, can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I'm just going to turn you up a little bit. That's all. Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. My name is Malcolm Mitter. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation here at UMass Amherst, and I'm also an applied forest ecologist. And so today I'll talk to you a little bit about some recent work to improve prediction of forest dynamics under global change. Just provide a little bit of start here by providing a little bit of motivation and context for the modeling approach I'll be discussing. And so forest ecosystems are dynamic, and they evolve over time and space, usually in response to some type of disturbance event or to variable environmental conditions. And so in applied forest ecology, if we think about forest dynamics, really what we're referring to there is changes in the species composition, size, density, or structure of that system over time and space, driven by underlying demographic processes such as growth, mortality, and regeneration. Now, for as long as we've studied forest dynamics, we probably have had models of forest dynamics. So these date all the way back to the 19th century. And in general, they were used to determine, forest yields over time in response to different management approaches. So same reasons that we would develop some kind of agronomy model, for example. And so they were developed using data sets similar to agricultural data. So experimental data sets that, span multiple decades or centuries. And again, basically looking at forest growth patterns in response to different types of management approaches. And so as you can imagine, the ecological complexity that's represented in these sorts of models has grown tremendously over the last 3 or 4 decades. And current or contemporary models of forest dynamics are now used as an important tool for understanding and predicting forest responses to global change. And so we can use predictions from these sorts of models to help us inform management strategies that are aimed at promoting forest resilience to changing conditions, to potentially predict levels of carbon storage over the long term, or to help us make public policy decisions that are aimed at maintaining forest ecosystem services. So the challenge with this is that, global change is contributing to fundamental shifts in forest dynamics, and those shifts are happening quite rapidly. These lead to high levels of uncertainty in future forest conditions, as well as in potential forest responses to adaptive management approaches. And so this uncertainty really necessitates a new generation of forest dynamics model that's aimed specifically at getting at or quantifying the uncertainty in these underlying forest dynamics, as well as helping us to inform our adaptive management decisions under these novel conditions. And so with this in mind, we could lay out some objectives for a predictive model of forest dynamics under global change. And in particular, we'd like a model that's capable of synthesizing different forest inventory data sets and combining that with long-term experimental data that we have, as well as a model that would be able to integrate and refine predictions using real-time monitoring data, address and quantify uncertainty in ecological processes, as well as noisy forest observations. And then lastly here, we'd like models that are capable of scaling these complex ecological processes to broad spatial temporal domains in a computationally feasible manner. And that would provide predictions at a spatial scale and in terms that are implementable by forest managers. And so if we look at these objectives, really what they point towards, particularly points 1 through 3 here, is some kind of dynamical model framework that synthesizes a process model of forest dynamics with observations of that forest ecosystem over space and time. And with this framework fitted within some Bayesian hierarchical approach, given the flexibility of those methods for breaking down complex processes into simpler conditional components, quantifying that uncertainty, as well as accommodating a diversity of data types. And so I'm not going to go into these frameworks in too much detail, but on a general level, but I would like to highlight just some of the key benefits of this sort of dynamical model framework. So the first of these is that with these models, we can generate probabilistic estimates of uncertainty in our model, as well as uncertainty from our data, and separate those two uncertainties, as well as get an uncertainty in our model parameters through our posterior distribution. We have the nice feature that basically our model fitting, our calibration of our forest dynamics model and our prediction occurs simultaneously, so that our predictions are continuously refined based on our data. And so this sets up a situation where we get statistical learning as new monitoring data become available. And in this context, it also provides an important mechanism for weighting future observations under novel conditions more heavily than we may want to for historic observations. And so if we go back to these objectives quickly, I think, these sort of dynamical model frameworks have existed for a long time, and they've been pretty widely accepted in ecology, certainly over the last decade or two. So there's an important question here, which is like, why have we not seen these sort of approaches applied more regularly in the context of applied forest ecology? And the answer really lies in these last two objectives here, which is that to date, we've really lacked a theoretical or physical model of forest change that's able to be integrated within a broader dynamical framework. And so the issue at hand has been that these theoretical models either don't exist or they're not in a form that basically is computationally feasible to integrate and scale up to broad spatial temporal domains, and further doesn't necessarily provide predictions at the spatial scale of interest. And so, this issue of scale is important enough that I think it warrants a little bit further discussion. And so we can ask this critical question of which scale should be modeling forest dynamics in the context of thinking about integrating our model within this broader dynamical framework. And so on the one hand, we could model forest dynamics at an individual tree scale, which has the benefits that, it's at the individual tree scale that our demographic processes are actually occurring. So certainly it has a lot of ecological significance. And in fact, most contemporary models of forest dynamics operate at that individual tree level. The downside to that approach is that if we're modeling demography at the individual tree scale, then it can be very difficult to integrate that model within a broader dynamical framework, because we now have to track the demographic fate of individual trees. So as you can imagine, the dimension of our model quickly blows up. And then surprisingly, the individual tree is not actually the scale of inferential interest in applied forest ecology settings. And so we could contrast this with a population or a forest stand scale model. And so our forest stand is our fundamental management unit in applied forest ecology. So this is the spatial scale at which forest management decisions are made. It's a scale which we typically think about forest resilience to novel conditions. As a forest manager is not necessarily interested in understanding individual tree demography. Really what they want to know is understand stand dynamics, and in particular stand dynamics in response to alternative management approaches. So it's certainly computationally easier to integrate a stand level model within a broader dynamical framework, because we now only need to track population level responses over time. But the downside to this approach is that most existing stand level models that we have are relatively simple, and they tend to reduce complex ecological processes to approximations of general forest development patterns. And so really what we need here is a model of forest dynamics that includes the level of demographic complexity that we find in individual level models, but models changes in populations or stands over time. And so enter cohort-based models of forest dynamics. And effectively what these approaches do is to group individual trees into cohorts that are based on, could be the age, but more regularly it's the size or some set of physiological traits that are used to generate those cohorts. And then applies demographic functions that were developed for individual trees to model changes in those cohorts over time. And so these models make a strong assumption that individuals within a cohort experience the same environmental conditions and experience the same competitive environment, and so thereby follow the same deterministic growth pattern. So this is quite a strong assumption. But despite that assumption, these sort of cohort-based approaches have been shown to well approximate a multitude of individual-based models of forest dynamics in different forest ecosystem settings. And so another reason that we like this sort of cohort-based approach is that under certain qualifying assumptions, we can express those cohort-based models as the well-known McKendrick von Forester PDE equation that's used to model, generally used to model physiologically structured population dynamics. And so I'm not going to go into this in too much detail here, just in the interest of time, but effectively what we have is we're modeling the changes in the density of trees of some given size S at some time T as a function of size and time specific growth, mortality, and fecundity functions. And so what this McKendrick von Forester PDE model provides us with is this sort of missing ingredient. So this scalable theoretical model of forest dynamics. And so what remains for us to do is to take that theoretical model and integrate it within a broader dynamical framework and start scaling up. And so that's what we've been working on for the last year here. And so I'll sort of demonstrate this approach with some very simple forest inventory data. So in this case, we've got a basic forest inventory plot that's providing us with counts of trees in given size classes. And so here it's just counts of trees in 2 centimeter size classes. And so we can model those counts using some Poisson distribution, conditional on some latent intensity function denoted there by gamma. And then there's that A parameter just denotes that there's a mapping that occurs to move from that inventory plot to put those counts on a per hectare scale. Our process model here basically follows directly from this McKendrick von Forester PDE, but we have to solve that PDE numerically. And in this case, we're applying the well-known escalator boxcar train method to numerically approximate the solution to that PDE equation. And so effectively what this escalator boxcar train method does is to take the continuous size space and break it up into a set of discrete cohorts. And then through a system of ordinary differential equations models the change in the cohort density, so the number of individual trees in that cohort, as well as the mean cohort size. And so we're applying, we further discretize that into discrete time and model changes in the forest system on an annual time step. So we're allowing for a new cohort of trees to form at each year in our model period. I'm going to sort of skip over some of the details on how we're modeling initial values here in the interest of time. And instead focus on this issue, which is that effectively those cohorts that are formed through the escalator boxcar train method don't necessarily align with the size classes for which we have observations from our inventory plot. And so we apply a Gaussian kernel convolution to map those escalator boxcar train cohorts back to the observed size classes in our model. And so effectively what we've been doing to sort of test this out is approximating forest dynamics in pine plantations, both white and red pine plantations. So they're single species stands, as simple as a case as you could have. And we've been using demographic functions that were modified from a well-known individual-based model of forest dynamics called SORT-T, which was developed to model forest dynamics in the Northeast. Our joint posterior sampled using Hamiltonian Monte Carlo that we coded up within STAN and implemented from within using the RSTAN package. And we've been utilizing this model for a wide range of simulated data sets, as well as some real data, some red pine plantation data that we have from the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, their continuous forest inventory program. And so I'll just show you some initial results here that come from one of the simulated data sets. So this is basically looking at the dynamics of a white pine plantation over a 50-year period. And so what you're seeing there is the evolution of the size distribution of that forest over the model period. And so we get an inventory plot observation every 5 years from this forest. And so you can see effectively in that top row there, like years 1 and 6 have inventory observations. So anywhere you see that you have points there, those are the inventory plot based estimates of the number of trees per hectare in that 2 centimeter size class. And then the black line there is our modeled intensity. So that's the posterior mean. And then the shaded region is our 95% credible interval. And so what you can see is that over time, in general, the number of trees per hectare tends to decrease, while the average size of that stand increases. And this is sort of what we would expect to find if that forest is following a general forest development pattern. We can also look at things across cohorts, so actually integrate across those individual cohorts and look at what's happening at the full population level. So in this case, this is the overall density of that stand expressed in terms of trees per hectare, as well as base area per hectare. And so again, here, those points are the inventory-based estimates of density. And then with the black line in the shaded region, we're providing the 95% or the posterior mean and 95% credible interval for our model-based predictions. And so sort of demonstrates the approach. And I just wrap up here with a quick summary that, basically these dynamical statistical models provide a foundation for a new generation of forest dynamics model. And the McKendrick Fund Forester PDE that was developed for physiologically structured population dynamics provides this missing component. So it provides this theoretical model of forest change that actually we can use to scale up these sort of dynamical processes. And we can take that PDE model and nest it within a broader statistical framework as an important first step toward improving understanding and prediction of forest dynamics under global change. And although we sort of demonstrated this here today with a very simple inventory plot, effectively what we're trying to do is to leverage the statistical advancements that have been made in dynamical models over the last 10 years or so, and leverage those to actually start scaling these sorts of models up to really large scale data sets. So thinking about modeling forest dynamics across all of the US inventory plots, for example. So with that, I will just wrap up here, and I hopefully left some time for the question. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I guess we have a canceled talk in the next session. So we have time for one question. Somebody wants one? We have a question from Raul.
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting, and the use of model. We have done some work on that alongside, and one of the problems we found is how to reliably incorporate spatial variability of model parameters to the model itself without increasing or allowing for error propagation. We found that is a common trait in most modeling, is when you move in the space, over the space, the modeling capabilities are not there for coping with spatial variability, which can be studied through geostatistics, for instance, and incorporating that into the model without increasing error propagation. That's, I think, a major challenge in the state of the art of modeling. And what would be your commentary alongside those thoughts?
Did you catch all that, Malcolm?
So I think I got most of it, but if you wouldn't mind just giving me the key question, that would be helpful. Because I don't think I quite
modeling error and the propagation in a spatio-temporal model.
How to reliably incorporate spatial variability of model parameters to the model itself without increasing for error propagation.
Okay, so if I hear it correctly, it's how to incorporate spatial variability in this case, it would be the underlying demographic parameters without increasing error propagation. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so effectively, in this case, in the case studies that we've been working with so far, largely been focused on individual sites, but you're right that effectively what we're trying to do is to scale this up across multiple sites. And then the challenge becomes, how do you actually allow for there to be calibration of local demographic parameters? And so there are so I guess the short of it is that I don't necessarily have a great answer yet because we haven't attempted to do this so far. But effectively what I have in my mind's eye is to actually, in one case, you could think about doing some kind of space variant coefficients model to model those demographic process parameters. But more likely what I would envision doing here is to re-express that PDE model as a integral difference equation and actually try to model that, model the redistribution kernel in a spatial temporal setting as a way to actually be able to model local dynamics while leveraging sort of the broad scale inventory data that we have at hand.
Thank you. I mean, and as you said, it's not done. It's just
It's not done. So this is like where we're trying to work towards. So the ideas that I have are largely in theory and not necessarily in practice. So.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Malcolm. Let's move on to our last talk with the time we have available here. So please come up. Do you have slides or just, yeah, okay. Okay, the conference. Yeah. Okay, good.
Good afternoon. Today I will be talking about the projection of future forest degradation under climate change in central and northeastern Ontario. Global warming causes climate change as a result of greenhouse gas emission. It is predicted to significantly affect the frequency and severity of extreme weather events and ecological disturbance. In 2022,
Sorry. Broadcasting.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Nura. There we go. That should be better. Sorry, please.
it's okay. In 2022, the IPCC warned North America is set to reach and even surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius level by 2050 if carbon emissions are not reduced. Ontario forests are already being affected by natural and anthropogenic disturbances, such as wildfire, that can lead to forest decline or degradation.
Just click once. That'll work.
So there are 7 indicators derived from Lancet and Moody's platform. Out of 6 indices from Lancet images from 1972 to 2020, and net primary productivity is calculated from Moody's data from 2001 to 2020. The cell cap transformation are calculated using the equation on this slide. For Lancet MSS, I applied the weight or coefficients of Kaut and Thomas, 1976. For Lancet TM and ETM plus, the coefficient of Christ and Ciccone, 1984, were used. And for Lancet 8, I used the coefficient of Bayag et al. 2014. These 7 indices are used for forest degradation indicator, which are combined into one composite forest degradation indicator using principal component analysis. And finally, all CFDI from 1972 to 2020 combined into one composite indicator, and that was the most informative indicators. Sign of climate change impact on Algonquin Park, including rainfall country, are already observable. The result of this study showed increasing trends in temperature in and near the study area. This study focused on an analysis of the forest dynamic changes in the study area from 1972 to 2020 and generating prediction of possible changes in 2050. Correlation and regression analysis. Slide is looking a little bit up. That's fine. So to understand the quantitative relationship between climate variables and forest degradation indicator, correlation and regression analysis was employed to predict future dynamic changes in forest cover in the study area. The relationship between forest degradation indicator and relevant climate variables affecting forest growth and health have not been fully examined. To determine how historic climate variables related to forest degradation indicator, the computed forest degradation indicator are statistically related to historic climate variables. The relationship are used to project composite forest degradation indicator into future using projected climate variables such as precipitation, moisture availability 1 and moisture availability 2 derived from the general circulation model. This research examined the usefulness of some CFDI in explaining forest disturbance patterns. The quantitative relationship between useful CFDI and climate variables are established. The impact of changes in temperature, precipitation, evapotranspiration, moisture availability on forest vegetation condition are studied from the perspective of the effect of temperature and water deficit. And multiple linear regression model was developed based on the dependent variable CFDI and independent variables climate variables. As this shown in the equation 1. Regression analysis was conducted based on the highly correlated dependent variable CFDI and independent variable precipitation, moisture availability 1 and moisture availability 2. That equation developed equation number 2. A predicted MLR model was then fitted to the. There is another equation we developed for 2050. This is equation number 3. So this is based on historical climate variable from 1972 to 2020. And equation 4 is the projected model based on the 2050 projected data. Forest disturbance and degradation are also monitored from 1972 to 2020. These long-term historical forest degradation maps are created by the trajectory analysis computed with the Lantender algorithms. This slide showing the example map of 2001 to 2020. One is full study area map. Another one is large scale map. These two maps also created from the regression model. One is based on 1972 to 2020 model and calculated using the raster calculator, and another map based on 2021 to 2020 model. Okay, this is the projected model for 2050. First one is based on the model 1972 to 2020 and fitted with the 2050 GCM data. Finally, there is a change map. This change map is based on the historical map 1972 to 2020 and projection map 2050. The future projection map of CFDI was produced using the 2050 prediction map of climate variables such as precipitation, MA1 and MA2, that one for 2050 climate data. Conclusion and findings. Climate variable precipitation, moisture availability 1, moisture availability 2, and CFDI were strongly correlated, allowing the defendant developed a regression model with a high coefficient of determination R square and a low RMSE. The result indicated 2050 will experience an average temperature increase of 3 degrees Celsius, projected yearly decrease in precipitation of 109.5 millimeter, evapotranspiration increase of 73.0 millimeter, and moisture deficit 28.47 millimeter, and 37.6 millimeter for moisture availability 1 and moisture availability 2, leading to the increased forest degradation as determined by the forest degradation indicators. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Any questions from?
I have a question. About your, when you defined the NPI coefficient at the beginning of your presentation, it's the difference between two numbers. Could you NI minus something?
NDVI?
Yes, NDVI.
NDVI is near infrared minus red